Hello, I'm Justin the Canadian Tuxedo. Welcome to the channel. Today we'll be talking about the Replacements box set entitled Dead Man's Pop. I'd like to preface that this is a bit of a different kind of review than I've done before, in that it's an album that I'm very familiar with. When I was growing up, it was difficult to find any of the Replacements albums, so I had only heard a handful of their songs. Don't Tell a Soul was the first of their albums that I found. Dead Man's Pop is a very unique thing as a box set. It tells the story of an album. It also gives a once could have been classic album a second chance. Regarded as sort of a chip on the shoulder for the band, the Mats originally started recording the album at Bearsville Studio, where simultaneously Metallica was recording Injustice for All. The band started with producer Tony Berg in seclusion, but very quickly things soured and climactically ended in a heated argument that urged Tony Berg to exit. Enter Matt Wallace behind the wheel, and they started to record what would become Don't Tell a Soul. After the record was completed, the record company hired Chris Lord-Alge to mix the final product. Now, the band weren't happy with how Don't Tell a Soul was mixed. The album sounded the way that the label wanted it to. They wanted the Replacements to fit into the mainstream, and while Chris Lord-Alge's mix is very well done, it greatly dilutes what makes the Replacements them, covering up bum notes and smoothing out rough edges with 80s pop rock sheen, lots of reverb and compression, and even adding drum machines and synths. When listening to Dead Man's Pop, it's hard not to think that if they had just let Matt Wallace mix the record in the first place, we might be telling a different tale about the band. I think this comes down to the band being a wild card in a business of music. Emphasis on the business. A wild card is great until it gets too wild. And I don't think the record company really knew what to do with the rough and tumble of the Replacements, and therefore didn't trust them to be themselves and still be successful. Now, I had heard about this mix through articles online and in interviews. It's the strangest thing to have something you've grown so used to hearing and have it changed radically and even improved. Included in this box set are the original Bearsville mixes, a session with Tom Waits, B-sides, outtakes, and a double live album. The thing is, Dead Man's Pop sounds like the Replacements, warts and all. They were never really a clean-cut band, and they never did things the traditional way. So, without further ado, let's dive into the album. I'm going to primarily focus on the newly mixed and resequenced album Dead Man's Pop. The album opens with Talent Show, a song that details how Paul Westbrook felt about the Replacements within the context of the music industry. It's cheeky and playful, and talking about how they're about to go on after some lip-sync chicks. On a Monday, I am waiting. Tuesday, I am fading. It's a simple song that basically sits on two chords most of the time, and it's a total earworm. The song's filled with acoustic guitars, rough electric guitars, banjo, percussion, and somehow this song really captures the essence of the band. There's this really cool part in the middle where everything kind of falls apart and then boom, the band kicks back in. It's a great introduction to the album, and probably one of my favorite Replacements tracks. I appreciate that in this newly remixed version, we get a full take of the performance as opposed to having the fade out. It's weird and fun, and it's exactly what you would expect from the band. With what is probably one of the best 1-2 punches for a record, we get I'll Be You. This is probably one of the most radio-friendly tracks on the album. There's something interesting about Paul's vocals on this in that it always kind of makes me think of Bryan Adams. Don't ask me why. There's some really great flourishes on this track with some slide acoustic guitar and piano bits. It's probably the closest thing to a pop song that they've ever released. This song seems to talk about Paul's lack of interest in celebrity and simultaneously his dissatisfaction with the Replacements' position in the industry. And that's just my interpretation. It's also interesting that Tom Petty used the line "Rebel Without a Clue" from this song in his track Into the Great Wide Open, as the Replacements opened for the Heartbreakers at one point. This was another fave off this record for me, and after the reverb and effects were stripped off, you can really appreciate the band's performance. It's their only Billboard charting track in their entire career. It's a solid track. Next is We'll Inherit the Earth. This song is probably one of the more dated sounding songs on this record. There seems to be influence from The Who, kind of like a galloping version of Love Reign Over Me. There's lots of weird sounds and piano and delay guitars, and this song is one of the more dramatically different versions within the remix. It's a bit rough, but it still feels authentically like them. It's also really interesting that the themes of this song still ring true today as they did back then. the inaffection with being satisfied with the world you are living in. We'll inherit the earth, but we don't want it. How can you look at the world around you and think, this is it? I'm supposed to want this? It's a timeless theme, and Paul seemed to be poignant and forward-thinking at this point in the band's career. Next we have Achin To Be, another classic Matt's track with twangy guitars, lap steel acoustic guitars, and a harmonica solo underneath Paul's gravelly emotive vocals. Paul sings about a girl who is misunderstood and conflicted and yearning to wear their heart on their sleeve, but afraid of the response. I might be reaching, but I feel like if you dig a little deeper, you can kind of see that it's mostly about Paul talking about himself. It's this dichotomy that comes through the band's ethos. While rough around the edges, their songs have this incredible earnest quality to them, and it's one of the best songs on the album, and one of their best songs in general. This remix really allows you to feel like you're in the room. There's not as much effects on there, and it just has a certain intimacy to it. This is followed up with Darlin One. This one kind of has like a U2 influence on it, and you can kind of hear it in Paul's vocal. The song has an almost marching quality to it. There's some very odd guitars on this. The lead guitars have this sort of exotic scale quality to them. This is one of the only songs on this record to be co-written by the whole band. Like others on this record, this song was greatly improved in the new mix by taking all the effects and reverb off, and while it's not maybe my favorite track on this record, it's still a decent midway track. Back to Back has a classic pop feel to it. It feels like Big Star, filled with acoustic guitars, glockenspiel, soft backing vocals, glistening electric guitars. It's a lighter track on this album. I think the lead guitars are a bit off-putting at times. They seem improvised and off the cuff, which again is a typical trait of the replacements. I think that in the original mix, they used lots of effects to cover up the mistakes and make it feel more palatable. I feel again that this version is still superior to the Chris Lord-Alge mix. It felt fluffy and like a filler track on the original. It seems to fit better in the track listing on this particular version. Then we get a ripper with I Won't, which is probably one of my favorite tracks on this album. This song constantly gets stuck in my head. This one feels more in line with their previous record, Pleased to Meet Me. Paul tears through the song with his powerful snarl, while the band bounces along and their sloppy faces meets the Stone style. Extra flourishes of harmonica and keyboards are added, and while this song doesn't have the lyrical depth of some of the other songs on this record, it's hard not to get caught up in the rollicking barn burner that this track is. Asking Me Lies comes next, which is another oddball track on this album, but it strangely works. It's kind of got a funky groove to it, kind of makes me think of Let's Dance era David Bowie. Asking Me Lies comes next, which is another oddball track on this album, but it strangely works. It's got a kind of funky groove to it, makes me think of Let's Dance era David Bowie, complete with falsetto backing vocals, piano, cowbell, funky bass lines, and slinky guitars. I've always loved this track. It's really catchy and very dancey. It has a really solid vocal from Paul Westerberg, and the new mix makes it sit better within the context of the band. It definitely comes off a lot less dated than it did on the original mix. Next we have They're Blind, which I never really loved on the original album. The mix always sounded very syrupy and hokey, and this new version is stripped back and sounds more like a folky country ballad. Kind of reminds me of something you'd expect from a latter-day Paul Westerberg solo record, and this is one of those moments where you can really appreciate Paul's songwriting ability, and it is complemented by the rough edges that are applied by the band. There's a really tasty blues guitar solo in this song, some gentle piano, mandolin, acoustic guitar, tremolo-drenched feedbacking electric guitars. It really gives this song some grandeur. It amazes me that all of this greatness was lying underneath the schmaltz of the original mix. To me, this song feels like a meditation on the expectations Paul had in the band, and from his fans, people's perception of him and how he feels misjudged and misrepresented. It's a gorgeous track, and it was done a disservice in the original mix, but it is classic here. Next we have the rocking stomper Anywhere's Better Than Here. This song is so engaging, from the pumping rhythm and raw guitars and Paul's growling vocals, but there's also some nuance and darkness that's brought on by the embellishments of the backing vocals, the acoustic guitars, and the haunting lead guitar lines. There's also some gentle lead guitar lines underneath the chorus. The bridge has this screaming guitar solo, and the end kind of reminds me of Bastards Are Young, with its monotone repetition. Even though I have no idea what this song is about, it feels like it's delivered with conviction and power. It's another great anthemic track on this record, and this version sounds a lot more aggressive and raw compared to the original. This album kind of ends in much of the way that many Replacements albums do, with some kind of statement or a ballad. In this case, we have Rock and Roll Ghost. This song is a haunting lament that seems to be about former guitarist Bob Stinson, and even Paul Westerberg himself. The regret and the cost of the rock and roll lifestyle. It's as powerful as, say, Here Comes a Regular off Tim. The song is mostly Paul with an acoustic guitar and some synths and a little bit of lead guitar and percussion. The new mix rumbles and creates an empty, cavernous hole similar to the sentiments within the song. It's a fitting but dark way to end this album, and again, it's another standout track by the band. This album has a lot of harrowing moments and draws inward deeply. Many of the songs that Paul wrote for this album reflected what he was seeing in himself and in the band. It kind of felt like the band got stabbed in the back by the record company. I think that the original mix sounded dated and covered up the blemishes that makes the Replacements so iconic. This new mix really shows the band in their natural state. It's raw, it's confounding, and at times it's filled with conflicting emotions and honest songwriting. I think having the addition of the original Bearsville sessions really contextualizes the story of the album. And having the live show gives you a snapshot of the band's live show at that time with Slim Dunlap. And the Replacements never really roared like this ever again. For me as a fan, I am grateful that this version finally saw the light of day. It really blew me away. It took an album that was challenging for me and shed a whole new light on it. Overall, I think I would give this set 4.5 thrift store denim jackets out of 5. If you slept on the original, and maybe now this is the time for you to go back and give this would-be classic a second look, you might be surprised what you find. Thanks for watching. If you like what you see, like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what your favorite Replacements record is, and what your favorite Replacements song is. Stay weird, my friends, and I'll catch you on the B-side.